Layla sat on the front steps of her small house, gazing out at the sky. The clouds were thick and dark, hanging low over the horizon like a heavy curtain ready to fall. The air was still, humid, and the storm, she knew, was coming. It was the kind of storm you could feel in your bones long before it arrived, a quiet tension that made everything else fade into the background. She rested her elbows on her knees, her thoughts far from the weather. Inside the house, she could hear David moving about, but even though they were just a few feet apart, it felt as if they were worlds away. It hadn't always been like this. Just 2 years ago, they had been the couple everyone admired, happy, connected, deeply in love. But something had shifted, and now they barely spoke. David had lost his job 6 months ago, and since then, everything had changed. He had worked at the same company for over a decade, a steady, reliable provider for their small family. But when the company downsized and his role was eliminated, he became a shadow of the man she had known. Layla had watched helplessly as David withdrew into himself, sinking deeper into depression with each passing day. At first, she tried to help, offering words of encouragement, trying to cheer him up with his favorite meals, suggesting they spend more time together. But nothing worked. David had closed himself off, building walls around his pain that she couldn't break through. And as much as she loved him, Layla was beginning to wonder if their marriage could survive the storm that had settled over their lives. She heard the front door creak open behind her and felt David's presence before she saw him. He stepped outside, his footsteps heavy, and sat down on the step beside her without a word. They sat in silence for a while, both of them watching the sky. "We need to talk, David," Layla said finally, breaking the stillness between them. Her voice was soft but steady. She had been building up to this moment for weeks, and now that it had arrived, she felt a strange calm wash over her. David didn't respond right away. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his shoulders slumped. Layla could see the weariness etched into his face, the shadows under his eyes that had deepened over the past months. He was a man broken by circumstances he couldn't control, and yet his pride wouldn't let him ask for help. "I don't know what to say," David muttered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Layla felt a pang of frustration, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had been patient for months, waiting for David to open up, but the weight of his silence was becoming too much to bear. "I'm worried about us," she said softly. "I'm worried about you. You haven't been yourself since you lost your job, and I don't know how to help you. It feels like we're drifting apart, and I don't want to lose you." David clenched his fists in his lap, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I'm trying, Layla," he said through gritted teeth. I don't know how to fix this." Layla closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back tears. She loved David more than anything, but his refusal to confront his pain was slowly tearing them apart. "I don't need you to fix everything," she said gently. "I just need you to let me in. We're supposed to be in this together, but I feel like I'm facing this storm alone." David turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that evening. There was a flicker of something in his expression, regret perhaps, or guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I don't want to drag you down with me," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I feel like a failure, Layla. I've let you down, and I don't know how to be the man you deserve." Layla's heart ached at his words. She reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly in her own. "You haven't let me down," she said quietly. "We've hit a rough patch, but that doesn't mean you're a failure. It just means we need to find a way to weather this storm together." For a moment, David didn't say anything. Then he sighed, the weight of the months of silence and unspoken fears lifting ever so slightly. He squeezed Layla's hand, his grip firm but hesitant. "I don't know how to do that," he whispered. Layla gave him a small, sad smile. "We'll figure it out, but we can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." The next day, the rain came in sheets, pounding against the windows of their small home. Layla stood in the kitchen, staring out at the downpour as she washed the dishes, her mind racing with thoughts of the conversation she had with David the night before. She had always believed in the strength of their marriage. They had been through difficult times before, financial struggles, family disputes, the pressures of balancing work and personal life. But nothing had ever shaken them like this. David's depression, his loss of purpose after losing his job, had created a chasm between them that she didn't know how to cross. Layla wiped her hands on a towel and walked into the living room, where David sat on the couch staring blankly at the television. She sat down beside him, close enough to feel his presence but far enough to give him space. "David," she said softly, breaking the silence, "have you thought about talking to someone? Maybe a counselor or pastor?" David's jaw tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't need a counselor, Layla," he muttered. "I just need to figure things out on my own." Layla sighed. "You've been trying to figure things out for months, and it's only getting worse. I'm worried about you and I'm worried about us. We can't keep going like this." David turned to face her, his eyes clouded with frustration. "You don't understand, Layla. I've always been the one who takes care of things. I've always been the provider, and now I don't know who I am anymore." "I understand more than you think," Layla said quietly. "But you're not alone in this. We're a team, remember? You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." David looked away, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know if I can." Layla reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You can, but you need to let me help you, and maybe we need to let God in too." David's eyes flickered at the mention of God, and for a moment Layla thought she saw a glimmer of hope. But then he shook his head, his expression hardening. "I don't know if that's going to fix anything," he said. Layla's heart sank, but she didn't push him further. She knew that David's relationship with God had always been complicated. He had grown up in a strict religious household, and over the years his faith had wavered. But Layla believed that God was the only one who could truly heal the brokenness in their marriage. "Just think about it," she said softly. "Please." Days passed and the rain continued to fall. Layla could feel the weight of their strained marriage pressing down on her, the constant tension making it difficult to focus on anything else. She went about her daily routine, working at the clinic, coming home to cook dinner, trying to engage David in conversation, but it all felt hollow, like she was just going through the motions. One evening, after another silent dinner, Layla excused herself and went into their bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness settle in her chest. She had always believed that their marriage was strong enough to withstand anything, but now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. Layla reached for her Bible on the nightstand and opened it to Psalm 34, verse 18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the verse over and over, letting the words sink in. She was broken-hearted. There was no denying that. But she also knew that God had not abandoned her. He was still with her, even in the midst of the storm. Layla bowed her head and whispered a prayer, her voice trembling. "Lord, I don't know what to do. I feel lost, and I don't know how to reach David. Please help us. Help me to trust that you are with us, even when things feel impossible." As she prayed, a sense of peace washed over her. It wasn't a solution, but it was a reminder that she wasn't alone. She could lean on God, even when David couldn't, or wouldn't. The turning point came a week later, during one of the worst storms of the season. The rain pounded against the roof, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Layla sat in the living room, watching the news and hoping the storm would pass soon. David was in the other room, his silence heavier than the storm outside. Suddenly there was a loud crash, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Layla jumped to her feet, her heart racing. She ran to the source of the noise and found David standing in the kitchen, surrounded by broken glass. The window above the sink had been shattered by a tree branch that had blown loose in the storm, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. David stood in the middle of the chaos, his face pale, his hands shaking. "David!" Layla exclaimed, rushing to his side. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though his eyes were wide with shock. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered. It just happened so fast." Layla quickly grabbed a broom and began sweeping up the glass, her heart still racing from the sudden noise. The wind howled through the broken window, sending cold air rushing into the kitchen. As she worked, she glanced at David. He stood frozen in place, staring at the mess as if he didn't know what to do. His hands were clenched into fists, and Layla could see the tension in his jaw. "David," she said gently, setting the broom aside. "It's okay. We'll fix it." He didn't respond, but Layla could see the turmoil in his eyes. This wasn't just about the broken window. This was about everything: the job loss, the depression, the strain on their marriage. It was as if the storm outside had broken something inside him as well. Without thinking, Layla reached for his hand, pulling him gently toward her. "Come sit down," she said softly. "We'll figure this out together." David allowed her to lead him to the table, where they sat in silence for a few moments. Layla could feel his trembling fingers in hers, and her heart ached for him. She could see how lost he was, how crushed in spirit. After a long moment, David finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I feel like everything is falling apart," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know how to fix it, Layla. I don't know how to fix us." Layla's heart clenched. She had been waiting for him to say those words for months, to finally open up and acknowledge the pain they were both feeling. "You don't have to fix everything on your own," she said gently. "We can't fix it alone, David. But we can ask for help." David looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. "Help from who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "From God," Layla said softly. "We've been trying to do this on our own for too long, but we don't have to. God is close to the broken-hearted, David. He hasn't abandoned us, even though it feels like everything is falling apart." David's gaze flickered, and for the first time in months, Layla saw a crack in the walls he had built around himself. He looked down at his hands, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I've been angry, Layla. Angry at myself, at everything, and maybe even at God. I didn't want to admit it, but I feel like I've failed you. I've failed us." Layla squeezed his hand, her voice filled with compassion. "You haven't failed, David. You're struggling, but that doesn't make you a failure. We've both been hurting, and we've both made mistakes, but we can heal from this if we let God in." David sat in silence for a long time, his brow furrowed in thought. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the kitchen, the tension between them had shifted. Layla could feel it, a softening, a quiet surrender. "I don't know how to do that," David admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know where to start." Layla smiled gently, her heart swelling with hope. "We start by praying, together." That night, for the first time in months, David and Layla knelt together in prayer. It was awkward at first, David's voice shaky, his words halting, but Layla didn't care. She could feel the presence of God in that small act of vulnerability, in the quiet surrender of two broken people seeking healing. They prayed for strength, for guidance, and for the courage to face the storm together. And as they prayed, Layla felt something shift between them, something deeper than words could express. It wasn't a quick fix, and it didn't erase the months of pain and distance, but it was a step toward healing, a step toward hope. In the days that followed, things didn't magically improve. The window was still broken, and David was still out of work. But something had changed. David was more present, more open. They talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like forever. He began to share his fears, his frustrations, and Layla listened without judgment. And in return, she shared her own heart, her own struggles, and together they began to rebuild the trust that had been eroded by months of silence. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Layla looked over at David, a smile tugging at her lips. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone light. "Maybe we should start going to counseling. You know, get some help working through all of this." David raised an eyebrow, but there was no resistance in his eyes. "Counseling," he echoed, a hint of humor in his voice. "You mean we haven't already solved all our problems with one prayer?" Layla chuckled, nudging him playfully. "I think it's going to take more than one prayer." David's expression softened, and he nodded. "Yeah, I think you're right." He paused, then added, "I'll go to counseling. I want to work on this, Layla. I want to work on us." Layla's heart swelled with gratitude. It wasn't going to be easy. She knew that. But for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. They were in this together, and that was enough. Over the next few weeks, David and Layla started attending counseling sessions at their church. The counselor, an older woman named Grace, was patient and wise, guiding them through the process of healing with compassion and understanding. There were difficult moments, tears, arguments, and confessions that were hard to hear, but there were also moments of clarity, of forgiveness, and of hope. David began to open up about his depression, his feelings of inadequacy, and the deep-rooted fears that had caused him to pull away. Layla shared her own struggles, admitting how hurt she had been by his withdrawal, how she had felt abandoned in their marriage. Through it all, Grace encouraged them to lean on their faith, reminding them that God was with them every step of the way. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional session, David and Layla walked out of the church together, the sun shining brightly overhead. The storm had passed, and the air was fresh with the scent of rain. David glanced over at Layla, a small smile playing at his lips. "I feel like we've come through something big," he said softly. "Like we've survived the storm." Layla smiled back, her heart light. "We have, and we're stronger for it." David nodded, his gaze thoughtful. I think I've finally realized something. I don't have to have everything figured out. I don't have to be perfect. I just have to be willing to keep trying, and to trust God." Layla reached for his hand, holding it tightly in hers. "That's all I've ever wanted, David. For us to keep trying, together." As they walked hand in hand toward their car, Layla felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The storm had tested their marriage, had brought them to the brink of breaking, but in the end, it had also brought them closer. They had learned to lean on each other, to lean on God, and to trust that even in the darkest moments, they were never truly alone. And as they drove home, the sun shining down on the road ahead, Layla knew that their journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Because they had weathered the storm, and they had come out stronger on the other side. The end. We hope you have enjoyed this story and have been inspired by it. If you have not yet subscribed to our channel, please do. Also, please like and share with others. It will encourage us to continue to make content like this available to you. Thank you.